Hi, this is my intro to The Godfather. Again, this is one of those movies that, in some sense, doesn't need a big introduction because I'll be surprised if you don't get into it. Um, you don't need bridges built for me with by me for this movie as much as you do with some. But there's so much to say about it. This is a movie that folklore has collected around. There's a whole body of legend around The Godfather. Um, and if you go online and you start looking at interviews with people who are in The Godfather, they love to talk about this movie. There's just so many. The director, Francis Ford Coppola, the people who are in the cast, a bunch of the people in the cast have become some of the most distinguished actors of the generation. And so Al Pacino and Robert De Niro and Robert Duvall. Marlon Brando has passed away now, but uh, Diane Keaton, all sorts of people who became really big actors were not necessarily big actors before The Godfather. Some of them were, some of them weren't. But this was a pivotal moment in the careers of a lot of actors, particularly Marlon Brando and Al Pacino, and I'll come back to them. They have the two biggest parts. One of them plays Vito Corleone, who is the Godfather when the movie starts, and one of them plays Michael Corleone, who's Vito's youngest son, who you'll see is very pivotal. Anyway, this movie was an unexpected classic. When I told you with Citizen Kane about how the film critics hold surveys and make Citizen Kane the best English language movie ever made, they vote for it and stuff like that. When they hold those surveys, very often the one that comes number 2 is The Godfather. Godfather Part 2 does pretty well too, but the original Godfather in the American Film Institute polls of critics, the first time it was held, Godfather came in number 3. The second time it was number 2. Everybody agrees that it's like a monument of American cinema. But at the same time, I don't think, if you struggled with Citizen Kane, I don't think you're going to struggle with this one. But there'll be things about how it works that are just different than any other movie. And it wasn't supposed to be. It was based on a novel that had been a huge bestseller. The Godfather by Mario Puzo, the novel, had top bestseller lists. It was a sensationalistic book about the mafia. And so it was like people ate it up, commercially speaking, but nobody thought it was a great novel. And you know how often you'll see movies made from books and people always say the book was better. I've never known anyone who said that about The Godfather. I've never met anyone who said the book was better than the movie. And that includes people who are very fond of the book. Nobody ever said that it was better than the movie. And it wasn't supposed to be art. The Paramount Pictures had money trouble. They got the rights to The Godfather. They wanted big box office. They didn't care. And it was one of these things, it's a novel like, I don't know, Twilight or 50 Shades of Grey. They figured there's a built-in fan base for it. We can sell tickets to this movie and don't mess this up because the financial future of the studio depends on it. And the key people involved in this movie, the director, the two main actors, the studio didn't want to hire any of them. Well, Coppola, they wanted to hire. Francis Ford Coppola, he hadn't done much as a director. He'd been an Oscar-winning screenwriter. He helped write the screenplay for Patton, which won an Oscar. And he always wanted to be a director. And I think from what he says, they basically hired him because he was Italian. This is a movie about the Italian mafia. And the head of Paramount Pictures, a guy named Robert Evans, who was not Italian, said, I want an Italian for this movie. I want you to be able to smell the pasta. Okay? So that's probably how Coppola got the job. And from pretty early on, the studio was not too happy with him. He was fighting with them all the time. He wanted to cast people they didn't want him to cast. The early rushes of the movie evidently had the studio scared out of its wits. They thought that he had chosen this color palette that was sort of dark and muted. And the pace of the movie was deliberate. It very much takes its time, this movie. And they were afraid he was just going to blow all their money for them because he was like, come on, pick it up. Let's get peppy. Let's get fast. Let's get, Let's get action scenes in here for crying out loud. What's going on with this movie? You're making a downer. We're going to lose our shirts. That was the kind of feedback he kept getting from the studio. And he had to do all kinds of political infighting just not to lose his job. Furthermore, the people he wanted to cast were not who the studio wanted to cast. He and Mario Puzo, who wrote the novel and also co-wrote the screenplay, wanted Marlon Brando to play Vito Corleone, to play the title character. And the studios wanted nothing to do with Marlon Brando. This was the early 1970s. When you saw Brando in On the Waterfront, movie was in 1954. It made him the biggest movie star in the world, and he was a big star really through the end of the 50s. But his movies started to bomb, one after the other, and some of them were very expensive bombs. And he got a reputation of being extremely difficult to work with, and that he had attitude all over the place, and he wouldn't learn his lines, and he was a nightmare to work with. And as long as he's still making the money, people put up with that, but the movies weren't making money either. So by the time you got to the late 1960s, Brando was considered a has-been, and nobody wanted to work with him. And he was box office poison. Okay? But there were still people who considered him the greatest actor of his generation, and Francis Ford Coppola was one of them. And he said, no, we need Brando. For this part, man, you want Brando. And the studios forbade him to even mention Marlon Brando. They did not want to hear any more about Marlon Brando in this part. And finally, Coppola threw enough of a conniption fit that they said, okay, you can consider Brando if you do three things. Get him to agree to do it for no money. Get him to sign some kind of waiver. If he messes up our schedule, he'll pay financial penalties for it. And make him do a screen test. So Coppola said yes, even though he didn't expect it. He knew he'd have to do the screen test. And so what he did, he said, I took a camera crew to Brando's house. I didn't say it was a screen test. We never use those terms because it's degrading to a great star to have to do a screen test. That's for beginners. It's not for people like Marlon Brando. So we never used that term, but he knew what was going on. And he said, I came into his house. He came out of his bathrobe. Brando was only 47 years old when he made this movie. And you'll see by the end of the movie, he looks like he's 80. But he was only 47 years old. He said, very, very handsome with long blonde hair. And he had read the script, and he said, I see this guy as a bulldog. So he took some shoe polish, and he darkened his hair, and he put the long hair up under, he concealed it in the back, and he under a cap or something. And he said, and he took some tissue. You'll see this is a lot. Look at her talking like this. And he said he took some tissue paper, put it under his lower lip, so he talks like this. And he said you just sort of wander around the living room, kind of picking things up and mumbling and turning into the character. It was all improvised. There was no script. Just sort of becoming Vito Corleone. And Coppola said it was an amazing thing to watch. You just saw this character happen. And he said, I took that footage home and I showed you some of the studio, the higher ups at the studio. And one of them said, that guy's great. Who is that? He didn't recognize it. He said, that's Marlon Brando. That's Marlon Brando? So Coppola got Brando into the part. So the other hard part was getting Al Pacino, who was not a known actor. He had been in one movie called something in Needle Park. He played a heroin addict in a little low budget movie. He said, I totally wanted him. The studio didn't want him. They thought he was too short. They thought he was too Italian. They didn't look right. They didn't even know who this guy was. They didn't want him. He said, I twisted arms. I was able to get Al Pacino for the part of Michael. But he said, and I've heard Pacino talk about this. He said for the first couple months, the word kept being that I was going to get fired. They were going to fire me and reshoot all my scenes. They didn't like me. They didn't want me. I hadn't been the idea in the first place. I wasn't what Robert Evans envisioned when he envisioned Michael. He said, Francis never talked to me about it. He said, but he did one thing. He took a key scene in the picture and he moved it up in the shooting schedule. I'll just say it's a scene in a restaurant, okay? It's a pivotal scene in the picture and it happens in a restaurant. So he said they moved the restaurant scene up in the shooting schedule so that the people who were looking at the daily rushes at the studio, he said, then they got to see what I could do. And that put to bed the idea of firing. And Pacino went on to, became a major star because of this movie. That launched, he became one of the major stars in the 1970s. He's still considered one of the great actors of his generation. He's a grand old man. He's in his 70s now, but he's one of the legends of his time. And this movie started all that. Okay, I'm going to take a break. I'll come back. Okay, so they were making this movie with all these people that the studio didn't want. The studio didn't like what they were seeing in the early rushes. Everybody felt they were on the brink of getting fired. They also, during the shoot, there were hijinks galore. Okay? Evidently, I don't know if you know the term mooning. That's when people drop their pants and show their butts to other people. Actors on the set were constantly mooning each other. Brando, Robert Duvall, who has a major, Duvall also became one of the big actors of his generation. James Caan. These guys, they were goofing around all the time. And evidently they had a lot of fun. But what we think of as a very serious movie, when the camera wasn't on people, they were cavorting like a bunch of 12-year-olds. The other thing about that you should know, this movie was Marlon Brando's comeback movie. He won his second Oscar for it. His career had been like done, and then it was suddenly revived, and it caused a sensation. He pulled that off, and I think nobody forgets this characterization. I think you'll find it's an extremely memorable character. They couldn't even get him to learn his lines. By this point in his career, Brando was incredibly lazy about even learning lines. It was very unprofessional. If I had an actor who would learn, so what they did was they had like little cheat sheets all over the set, so that the camera's in on Marlon Brando and you don't see that he's got a cheat sheet like below the line of the camera. He had become a master at reading lines instead of memorizing them. And normally, any of you, if you ever act, you can't get away with that. Nobody can get away with that because people sound different when they're reading off a script than they do if they're just talking like a person. That is, everybody except Marlon Brando. He could pull it off. He could pull off this legendary performance when he didn't even learn his freaking lines. It's wild. It's wild. Nobody's ever had talent like that. That's the thing with him. He could get away with stuff nobody else could get away with. And I'll give you one other little anecdote. I might have said this when we watched On the Waterfront. But Al Pacino, he was in his 20s at the time this was made, and Brando was 47. He grew up on Marlon Brando. He claimed, I heard him claim in an interview, that when On the Waterfront came out, Pacino was a teenager. He said, I went to see it every night, 12 nights in a row. I could not stop looking at that movie. I could not stop thinking about that movie. And he said, basically, I could not stop looking at and thinking about Brando and his performance. He said it was like one of the reasons I wanted to be an actor was because I wanted to do what that guy was doing. So he said the first scene that he shot with Brando, he said, I was shaking like a leaf before the shooting part began. somebody said, "Al, what's the trouble? You don't look quite yourself." And he said, I looked at the other guy and I said, "You don't understand. I'm acting with God." What's it like to work with the man you have idolized to that extent? But got to do it. And actually, if you see the scenes between them are beautiful. This father-son thing they do is just great. That father-son chemistry between those two actors is part of the glory, one of the glories of the movie. Okay, so this movie came out. It was a stupendous success. It was an overwhelming success. It's killed at the box office. It became it really kind of set people, the mythology of the mafia has in many ways been created in the American psyche by this movie. Now, whether this is what the mafia was really like, you could certainly argue it's a very romanticized version of the mafia. But the American fascination with gangsters, we've always had that fascination with criminals and gangsters. James Cagney and Edward G. Robinson made their careers playing Humphrey Bogart, playing shady, violent criminals. So it's not that The Godfather started the American fascination with gangsters, but in some sense, the images they left behind have defined what we think of the mafia. And it's worth thinking about why do we want to think about criminals in this way? This movie has become mythic. And it's worth keeping that question in the back of your mind. Why does this vision of the mafia, why does it have such legs? Why did this nation embrace this story the way it embraced this story? Keep that question in your head. Okay? I'm going to throw one other thing at you too. Well, no, I won't. We can talk about that later. That might disrupt your relationship with the movie, so I'm going to let it go at that. All right?